In 1998, a heinous crime was perpetrated in the affluent riverside neighborhood of Sunnyside. Sarah Brenner, a white college professor, was discovered in a state of significant physical distress and robbed in a local park. The incident provoked a profound sense of shock and outrage across the city. The local population demanded a swift resolution to the investigation, and attitudes towards the case exhibited significant variation based on race and social background. The police were obliged to act with haste in order to provide reassurance to the public. However, rather than conducting a fair and impartial investigation, the police permitted their personal biases to influence the outcome, thereby contravening the principles of procedural justice. 2 days following the incident, the police apprehended 2 adolescents. The 2 adolescents in question were 16-year-old Marcus Hayes and 15-year-old Floyd Spencer, both of African American ethnicity. The only possible basis for holding them responsible was their presence in the vicinity of the crime scene. The police presumed that their backgrounds and low social status made them evident suspects. The subsequent 12-hour period in police custody constituted a particularly challenging experience for Marcus and Floyd. They were subjected to a highly degrading and brutal interrogation process. This not only demonstrated a deficiency in professionalism but also indicated that the police officers held deeply entrenched racist beliefs. From the moment of their arrest, the police treated the teenagers in a manner that reflected a presumption of guilt. The police officers perceived the teenagers as members of dangerous racial groups and assumed their guilt based on their background. The detectives were transparent about their biases. It was repeatedly asserted that Marcus and Floyd were presumed to be culpable on the basis of their racial and ethnic identity. Throughout the interrogation, the detectives made statements that were indicative of racial bias, such as, "You are black, therefore you will be found guilty," and "people like you always commit crimes like this." The police officers were highly skilled at exploiting the teenagers' anxieties, leveraging racial bias to exert control over them. The detectives informed Marcus and Floyd that the legal system was inherently biased against white victims and advised them not to pursue justice. The detectives informed the teenagers that they would be perceived as unreliable witnesses due to their backgrounds and that they would be unlikely to receive a fair trial. Such rhetoric effectively dissuaded them from attempting to resist. Marcus and Floyd were held incommunicado, deprived of sleep and denied access to legal counsel. The police ensured that the interrogations continued for an extended period of time, with the intention of exhausting the teenagers psychologically. Marcus, having been subjected to relentless pressure, signed a confession that was read to him. The confession included details about the crime that the subject was unable to have been aware of. He had consented to this course of action under duress from the investigating officers, in the hope that it would prevent him from enduring further distress. Floyd was more acutely aware of his vulnerability due to his age. When he was asked to sign the documents, he did so out of concern for his personal safety and due to the belief that he had no opportunity for evasion. In lieu of pursuing tangible evidence, law enforcement agencies prioritized the construction of a narrative that would be readily accepted by the public. It would appear that the absence of DNA evidence from Marcus or Floyd at the scene of the crime, coupled with the lack of corroboration from witnesses as to their presence in the park, were not subjected to sufficient scrutiny. The detectives disregarded evidence that did not align with their preconceived notions and thus failed to subject it to sufficient scrutiny. It was their unwavering conviction that if the defendants were not Caucasian, they must be culpable. This was not the result of the actions of a single officer, but rather a consequence of the collective actions of numerous officers. This was a recurrent phenomenon. This was part of a broader pattern of behavior whereby minorities were frequently regarded as the natural suspects. Subsequent police reports indicated that the decision to detain the teenagers was perceived as an appropriate course of action. One officer even stated that it was of the utmost importance to ensure that the reputation of the police force was not tarnished as a result of this case. These individuals were eminently suitable for the role in question. The police not only failed to fulfill their professional duties, but they also used the case to reinforce stereotypes about minority criminality. The system was permeated with racial bias, which resulted in Marcus and Floyd being denied a fair trial. They were victims not only of an unfair system, but also of the deep-seated prejudices that it perpetuated. The investigation was initiated by a series of aggressive tactics employed by the 3 detectives, namely John Harris, Ben Scott, and Lisa Ray, with the objective of eliciting a confession from the teenagers. It was of no consequence to them that these adolescents were not complicit in the criminal act. It was of paramount importance to identify an individual who could be linked to the crime, thus avoiding the necessity for the police to respond to superfluous inquiries. John Harris and his colleagues exhibited a discernible bias. He was a middle-aged man with over 15 years of experience as an investigator in the field. he was renowned for his brutality and for exhibiting a manifest racial bias. From the outset, Harris regarded the teenagers as a mere cohort of typical criminals, deserving of punishment regardless of the actual evidence. These individuals are precisely the ones we're seeking, he informed his colleagues. He was the first to pursue justice by establishing culpability. Ben Scott perceived himself as a figure primarily concerned with upholding order and justice. However, his concept of justice was limited to punitive measures directed at those he perceived as a threat. In discussions with teenagers, he frequently displayed a lack of respect for their backgrounds. Scott was candid about his prejudice, stating, "If you are black, you will invariably be perceived as culpable. It is irrelevant whether one is innocent or not. One cannot emerge victorious, given that the court in question is only accessible to white people." This was a recurring topic of discussion between Scott and Marcus and Floyd. Lisa Ray, she was a junior detective, relatively inexperienced in serious work, and initially taken aback by the brutality of her older colleagues. However, she was able to adapt her approach to suit the circumstances. Her role was merely to ensure compliance with the established regulations. However, she was aware that without her intervention, the adolescents would be unable to cope with the increasing pressure. She capitalized on their anxieties to obtain signatures on statements that did not reflect the truth. She was notably proactive and did not hesitate to take a firm stance in this case. In lieu of gathering objective evidence, the police began to fabricate a false impression of what had transpired. The investigators failed to notice the absence of DNA evidence at the crime scene, did not conduct comprehensive interviews with witnesses, and overlooked apparent inconsistencies in the evidence. The objective was not to apprehend the actual perpetrator, but to conclude the process expeditiously and effortlessly in a manner that aligned with their preconceived notion of culpability. Following the arrests of Marcus and Floyd, their trial was conducted in a manner that was unfair and unjust. The proceedings were marred by a number of conspicuous irregularities, including the judge's evident partiality and the manner in which the testimony was handled. In light of the aforementioned evidence, it can be reasonably concluded that the trial was, in essence, a mere formality. The judge presiding over the case, Walter Grace, was responsible for ensuring that the prosecution was not subjected to adequate scrutiny. From the outset, it was evident that Judge Walter Grace was predisposed to view the teenagers in a negative light. Moreover, he asserted that the defendants fit the typical profile of criminals, which suggested that he had already reached a conclusion. His remarks undermined the presumption of innocence, which had a significant impact on the jury's approach to the case. The jury members were predominantly white and from affluent backgrounds, which presented a challenge to maintaining impartiality. It was challenging for the jury to empathize with the experiences of teenagers from disadvantaged areas, as their opinions were informed by social and racial stereotypes. The defense was not provided with the customary conditions that would typically be available to them. The attorneys endeavored to present compelling arguments, yet they were constrained by the influence of intimidation and manipulation. However, they were unable to make any progress with the judge and the prosecution, who were unyielding in their stance. The Marcus and Floyd trial offers a cautionary example of how deeply entrenched social issues can result in outcomes that are unfair and unjust. Let us examine the key elements of this case in order to ascertain the extent to which racial bias and a lack of impartial justice were involved. From the outset, it was evident that Judge Walter Grace was exhibiting bias. The judge's assertion that the teenagers exhibited the typical profile of criminals constituted a violation of the presumption of innocence, as it presumed their guilt. The judge's comments to the jury conveyed a sense of culpability towards the defendants, suggesting a presumed guilt. This illustrates a dearth of respect for the defendant's rights and provides a clear example of racial stereotyping at the highest levels of the judiciary. It would appear that the confessions of the teenagers were obtained in contravention of the relevant legal procedures, and thus the prosecution proceeded to build its case on them. It seems probable that the interrogations were conducted under duress and in contravention of established protocols. The defense team highlighted a number of inconsistencies and requested that the confessions be excluded from the case on the grounds of their unreliability. Nevertheless, Judge Grace remained unmoved in her rejection of all the motions, despite the forceful arguments presented by the defense. This resulted in Marcus and Floyd being denied the opportunity to mount a defense, effectively bringing the trial to a conclusion. The sentence handed down to the teenagers was disproportionately severe. The 15-year sentence handed down to Marcus and the 12-year sentence handed down to Floyd demonstrate that the U.S. court system frequently imposes more severe penalties on individuals from marginalized communities. By stating that neighborhoods like this breed criminals, Judge Grace implied that the circumstances were unfair and suggested that racial prejudice may have influenced his decision. 8 years later, the passage of time has resulted in a sense of stasis for Marcus and Floyd, with the sentencing date of 1998 remaining a fixed point in their lives. They remain incarcerated, serving lengthy prison sentences for a crime they did not commit. A local black journalist, Darrell Brooks, who worked for the Riverside Observer, identified some anomalies in the archived documents and initiated an investigation into the case. He identified some inconsistencies and initiated an inquiry, which promptly attracted the attention of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The case was reopened and the subsequent investigation swiftly revealed the shocking truth. It subsequently emerged that the actual perpetrators were not Marcus and Floyd, but Judge Walter Grace's son Timothy Grace and his acquaintance Thomas Miller, who had previously been a student of Sarah Brannan. They sought retribution for what they perceived to be humiliation at the hands of Brennan, who had publicly censured them during a lecture. Upon his release, Marcus observed that the external environment had undergone considerable transformation. The period of incarceration had a profound impact on him. He was diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder, which manifested as recurrent nightmares and panic attacks. His aspirations to pursue an education and become a teacher were effectively thwarted. Despite exploring a range of potential avenues, Marcus was unable to secure gainful employment due to the social stigma attached to being an ex-convict. Even after his exoneration, he was persistently attempting to reinstate his life trajectory, yet the very system that had failed him was unable to provide the requisite assistance. Floyd's circumstances were even more unfortunate. During his period of incarceration, his mother passed away. The emotional distress caused by the loss of her son proved overwhelming for her to cope with. Following his release, his father was unable to maintain a relationship with him. Floyd experienced a sense of disconnection and alienation within the familial environment. In the wake of the dissolution of his familial unit, he found himself without a domicile, striving to discern a rationale for his existence in a world that seemed to have denied him one. The acquittal of Marcus and Floyd prompted a substantial public reaction. The case attracted considerable media attention across the country, thereby drawing attention to deficiencies in the justice system. Once the Federal Bureau of Investigation had established the veracity of the facts in question, the trial proceeded to a subsequent phase. The judge's son and his accomplice were apprehended, marking the commencement of the process of elucidating the manner in which the system permitted justice to be subverted. Judge Walter Grace was removed from office and found guilty of corruption, manipulation of justice and the withholding of evidence. His actions, which were aimed at punishing the innocent for his own benefit, prompted a substantial re-evaluation of practices within the judicial system. Although the period of incarceration experienced by Marcus and Floyd cannot be undone, their exoneration represented a significant advancement in the struggle against racial injustice. The protests and public debate resulted in a number of judicial reforms, including new regulations were introduced governing the handling of juvenile defendants, which prohibited the use of coercion or manipulation during interrogations. The rules pertaining to the gathering of evidence and the verification of alibis were subjected to rigorous scrutiny and subsequently reinforced. A commission was constituted with the objective of investigating cases where there were concerns regarding the investigative techniques employed. The case illustrates that even after reforms have been implemented, the consequences of wrongful convictions can still be significant. The miscarriage of justice in the Sunnybrook case has come to symbolize the persistence of racial and social injustice within the justice system. The experiences of Marcus and Floyd serve to illustrate the potential consequences of bias and to highlight the necessity for reform. Despite the efforts of society to address the circumstances, the deaths of two innocent individuals were ultimately unavoidable. The lives of the two men had been irrevocably altered.